In 1973, a Texas oil man named Harlan Wheatley walked into a dusty barn in rural Oklahoma and found something that would change his life forever. Sitting beneath 40 years of cobwebs and chicken droppings was a 1932 Duesenberg Model J, one of the most valuable automobiles ever built in America. The farmer who owned it had no idea what he was sitting on. He thought it was just his grandfather's old car. Wheatley bought it for $12,000. 3 years later, he sold it for over $1 million. And that single transaction sparked something extraordinary, a collecting frenzy among America's wealthiest families that would transform forgotten automobiles into objects of desire worth more than Picasso's. This is the story of the legendary car collections built by wealthy American dynasties and the incredible machines they preserved. Along the way, we'll encounter barn finds worth fortunes, family feuds over fenders, and cars so rare that fewer than 5 exist on Earth. So let us begin. But first, what made these particular automobiles so valuable in the first place? See, to understand why certain families became obsessed with collecting American cars, you have to understand what American cars used to be. And I mean really understand it. Because the automobiles built in America between roughly 1920 and 1942 weren't just transportation. They were rolling works of art, handcrafted by companies that no longer exist, using techniques that nobody uses anymore. Take Duesenberg. The name alone still carries weight among collectors. Fred and August Duesenberg were German immigrants who started building race cars in Iowa, which honestly sounds like the setup to a joke. But it's true. They won the Indianapolis 500 3 times before they ever built a road car. When they finally did, in 1928, they created the Model J, and it was unlike anything America had ever seen. The Model J had a straight 8 engine producing 265 horsepower in 1928. For context, most cars at the time were making maybe 40 horsepower. The Duesenberg was advertised with a single slogan that told you everything you needed to know: the world's finest motor car. And the thing is, they weren't lying. These cars could hit 116 miles per hour right off the showroom floor. They cost between $13,000 and $17,000 at a time, when a Ford Model A cost about $500. Now, I mention this because these were never common cars. Duesenberg built fewer than 500 Model Js before going bankrupt in 1937. And of those, many were destroyed, scrapped for parts during the World War II, or simply left to rot in barns like the one Harlan Wheatley found. The survivors became the foundation of some of the most valuable car collections in the world. But Duesenberg wasn't alone at the top. There was also Packard, which built the cars that presidents rode in. There was Pierce Arrow, favored by the old money families of the Northeast. There was Cord, with its revolutionary front-wheel drive and coffin nose styling that still looks futuristic today. And there was Cadillac, which in the 1930s built a V16 engine, 16 cylinders, just because they could. These were the cars that wealthy collectors would spend decades hunting. And the families who accumulated the finest examples created something more than just garages full of old metal. They created museums, time capsules, preservation societies for an era of American craftsmanship that would never come again. The thing is, these collections didn't appear overnight. They were built over generations, often by men who started buying cars that nobody else wanted during times when nobody else cared. One of the most remarkable collections belonged to the Nethercutt family of California. J.B. Nethercutt made his fortune in cosmetics. He founded Merle Norman. But his true passion was automobiles. Starting in the 1950s, when you could still find classic cars for reasonable prices, Nethercutt began buying, and buying, and buying. His approach was different from most collectors. Nethercutt didn't just want the cars, he wanted them perfect. He established a restoration shop that became legendary in the collecting world. employing craftsmen who could recreate wood panels, stitch leather interiors, and rebuild engines to factory specifications. Some restorations took 5 years or more. But when a Nethercutt car rolled out of that shop, it wasn't just restored, it was better than new. The collection eventually grew to include over 250 automobiles, housed in a purpose-built museum in Sylmar, California. The Grand Salon, as it's called, features cars displayed in a setting that looks like something out of Versailles: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and automobiles polished to mirrors. The Nethercutt collection includes multiple Duesenbergs, several Packards, rare Cords, and even a handful of cars that exist nowhere else on Earth. I love this part. Nethercutt was so dedicated to authenticity that he once tracked down original factory workers from companies that had been defunct for decades just to interview them about how certain parts were made. He wanted to know the exact thread count of the upholstery fabric used on a 1933 Cadillac. That's commitment. But the Nethercutts weren't the only family building a legendary collection. On the other side of the country, a very different kind of collector was assembling something equally remarkable. William Harrah started as a bingo parlor operator in Reno, Nevada, before building an empire of casinos that made him one of the wealthiest men in the American West. But Harrah's true obsession was cars. And unlike Nethercutt, who focused on Concours level perfection, Harrah wanted everything. By the time he died in 1978, Harrah had accumulated over 1,400 automobiles. Not a typo, 1,400. The collection was so large that it required multiple warehouses to store, and Harrah employed a full-time staff of over 100 people just to maintain it all. Now here's where it gets interesting. Harrah wasn't just collecting for beauty or prestige. He was trying to preserve the entire history of the American automobile. He bought cars that other collectors ignored: early brass-era vehicles, quirky one-offs, prototypes, failures. If it had 4 wheels and a motor, Harrah wanted it. The collection included over 200 Fords alone, tracing the company's history from the earliest models through the muscle car era. There were 40 Packards, 30 Duesenbergs, dozens of Lincolns, and enough Franklins to fill their own museum. Harrah also collected the bizarre: 3-wheeled cars, steam-powered cars, electric cars from the turn of the century that most people had forgotten ever existed. Think about that for a second. This was one man's private collection. More cars than many museums have, more variety than most people could see in a lifetime of visiting car shows. And it was all housed in warehouses in the Nevada desert, maintained by an army of mechanics who treated each vehicle like a patient in a hospital. When Harrah died, the collection became the subject of intense speculation. What would happen to all these cars? The answer, unfortunately, was complicated. Holiday Inn, which had acquired Harrah's casino business, decided the car collection was too expensive to maintain. They began selling off vehicles, and over the following decades, many of Harrah's cars were scattered to collectors around the world. But the core of the collection survived. It eventually became the National Automobile Museum in Reno, which still houses over 200 vehicles from the original Harrah collection. Walk through that museum today, and you're walking through one man's obsession with preserving American automotive history. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question: where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, back to the collectors. Because not all of these legendary collections were built by businessmen with unlimited budgets. Some were assembled by people whose passion far exceeded their resources. The Cunningham family of Rochester, New York, represents a different kind of collecting story. James Cunningham, Son and Company, had been one of America's premier carriage builders before the automobile age, and when cars replaced horses, they made the transition, building some of the most elegant automobiles of the early 20th century. When the company finally closed in 1936, the Cunningham family retained many of their own creations. These weren't purchased at auctions or discovered in barns. They were simply kept, generation after generation, maintained in the family's private collection. By the time collectors began paying serious attention to classic American cars in the 1970s and 1980s, the Cunninghams owned vehicles that had never left their family's possession since the day they were built. This kind of provenance, unbroken ownership, documented history, original everything, is the holy grail for collectors. A car that has been cherished by one family for 90 years is worth considerably more than an identical car that has passed through dozens of hands. The Cunningham vehicles represented a direct link to the era when American craftsmanship meant something different than it does today. And speaking of provenance, we should talk about the Imperial Palace collection, because it represents yet another approach to assembling automotive history. Ralph Engelstad was the owner of the Imperial Palace Casino in Las Vegas, and like Harrah before him, he used his gambling fortune to indulge his automotive passion. But Engelstad had a specific focus. He collected the cars of the famous and powerful, presidential limousines, vehicles owned by celebrities, cars with stories attached. The collection at one point included automobiles owned by Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and Emperor Hirohito, which, I should mention, generated considerable controversy. But it also included more benign pieces of history, cars owned by Al Capone, Howard Hughes, Elvis Presley, and multiple American presidents. Engelstad's approach was about narrative as much as machinery. Every car in his collection came with a story, a famous owner, a moment in history. The vehicles weren't just beautiful objects. They were artifacts of the people who had sat in their seats and gripped their steering wheels. When you looked at a car in the Imperial Palace collection, you weren't just seeing a machine, you were seeing power, fame, and history made tangible. The collection eventually numbered over 700 vehicles and was displayed in a massive showroom attached to the casino. Visitors could wander among Duesenbergs, once owned by movie stars, and Packards that had carried generals. It was part museum, part entertainment, and entirely a reflection of one man's vision of what car collecting could be. But all collections, no matter how carefully assembled, eventually face questions of succession. What happens when the collector dies? What happens when the family loses interest? What happens when the money runs out? The Getty family offers one answer to these questions. The Gettys, of course, made their fortune in oil, and several family members became passionate automobile collectors. But unlike the Harrahs or Engelstads, the Gettys approached collecting as a long-term family enterprise. Gordon Getty, one of J. Paul Getty's sons, assembled a collection that focused specifically on the finest examples of American classics. His approach combined the Nethercutt passion for perfect restoration with the Harrah commitment to historical significance. The cars in the Getty collection weren't just beautiful or rare. They were the best surviving examples of their type, restored to standards that would satisfy the most demanding concours judges. What made the Getty approach different was the family's commitment to keeping the collection together. Rather than allowing cars to be sold off piecemeal, the family established protocols for maintaining and displaying the vehicles as a unified collection. The cars appear at major shows, but they remain family property, passed down through generations with the same care that other families might give to art or real estate. This multi-generational approach represents the ideal outcome for many collectors, the cars they spent decades acquiring, the vehicles they lovingly restored, the machines that represent thousands of hours of work. They want those things to survive. They want future generations to see what American automobile manufacturing once achieved. Not every collection gets that happy ending. When collectors die without clear succession plans, or when heirs have different priorities, collections can be dispersed with shocking speed. Auction houses like R.M. Sotheby's and Macomb have made fortunes selling off the accumulated treasures of deceased collectors. A collection that took 50 years to assemble can be scattered across the world in a single afternoon of bidding. I should mention the Otis Chandler collection here, because it represents both the heights of collecting achievement and the inevitable dispersal that follows. Chandler was the publisher of the Los Angeles Times and heir to one of Southern California's most prominent families. His collection was eclectic in the best sense. American classics alongside European sports cars, motorcycles mixed with automobiles, race cars displayed next to luxury sedans. The Chandler collection reflected a lifetime of passion rather than a narrow focus on any single type of vehicle. But after Chandler's death in 2006, the collection was eventually sold. The auction, held by Bonhams, generated millions of dollars but also represented the end of something that could never be recreated. The cars went to new owners around the world, and what had been a unified expression of one man's taste became scattered atoms of a former whole. This is the tragedy that haunts serious collectors. They know their time is limited. They know that what they've built will eventually face the question of what comes next. Some establish foundations, some donate to museums, some simply hope that their children will share their passion. But the truth is that most collections eventually are broken up and sold, and yet new collectors continue to emerge and new collections continue to be built. The torch passes from one generation to the next, even if the specific vehicles change hands along the way. Consider the current generation of American car collectors. Many of them are tech entrepreneurs who made their fortunes in Silicon Valley and have now turned their attention to acquiring the machines of an earlier industrial age. There's something poignant about software billionaires collecting the handcrafted automobiles of the 1930s, men who made their money in virtual spaces, now obsessing over physical objects of steel, leather, and wood. These new collectors are driving prices to levels that would have astonished earlier generations. A Duesenberg Model J that sold for $1 million in the 1980s might sell for $20 million today. A rare Cord 8112 supercharged convertible, once available for a few $100,000, now commands prices in the seven figures. The market for the very best American classics has become as rarefied as the market for impressionist paintings or ancient antiquities. But something else has happened as well. As the top-tier cars have become unaffordable, for all but the ultra-wealthy, a new generation of collectors has turned its attention to more accessible vehicles. The muscle cars of the 1960s and 1970s, once considered too recent to be truly collectible, have become the focus of passionate enthusiasts. A pristine 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda, once just an old used car, now sells for millions. This democratization of collecting means that the tradition of assembling significant automotive collections is no longer limited to families with oil fortunes or casino empires. Middle-class enthusiasts are building collections of more modest vehicles, preserving pieces of American automotive history that might otherwise be lost. The Studebakers and Hudsons and Nashes and Kaisers, brands that disappeared decades ago, are being rescued and restored by collectors who remember riding in them as children. The early Mustangs and Camaros and Challengers, the cars that defined American youth culture in the 1960s, are being preserved by collectors who bought them new and have never let them go. And what of the great family collections? What of the Nethercutts and the Harrahs and the Gettys? The Nethercutt collection remains open to the public in Sylmar, California, still maintained to the extraordinary standards that J.B. Nethercutt established decades ago. The museum continues to acquire vehicles and conduct restorations, ensuring that the collection remains a living enterprise rather than a static memorial. The National Automobile Museum in Reno preserves the core of the Harrah collection, though the majority of his original 1,400 vehicles have long since been dispersed. Still, visitors can see examples of his vision, the attempt to preserve not just the finest automobiles, but the entire history of American automotive development. The Imperial Palace collection was sold off after Ralph Engelstad's death, the cars scattered to new owners who may or may not understand the stories attached to each vehicle. The showroom that once displayed over 700 cars is gone, another Las Vegas entertainment venue that served its purpose and then vanished. And new collections are being built as we speak. In private garages across America, wealthy enthusiasts are assembling their own automotive museums. Some focus on American classics. Others collect European exotics, or Japanese sports cars, or vintage racing machines. The specific vehicles change with each generation, but the impulse remains the same, the desire to preserve, to protect, to keep something beautiful from disappearing into history. These private collections represent something uniquely American. In no other country did the automobile become such a powerful symbol of freedom, prosperity, and technological achievement. In no other country did so many companies build so many different kinds of vehicles, creating a diversity of design and engineering that offers endless possibilities for collectors. The wealthy families who accumulated these legendary collections weren't just indulging personal whims. They were creating archives of American industrial achievement. They were preserving evidence of an era when American manufacturing led the world, when American designers created objects of genuine beauty, when American engineers solved problems that nobody else had figured out yet. Walk through one of these collections, and you're walking through the story of American ambition. The Duesenbergs that proved Americans could build the finest cars in the world, the Packards that carried presidents and captains of industry, the Fords that pointed toward the automotive future with their streamlined designs, the Cadillacs that defined American luxury for generation after generation. These cars are time machines. They transport us back to an era before interstate highways and suburban sprawl, when roads were adventures and automobiles were still magical. The collectors who preserved them understood something important, that objects can embody history in ways that books and photographs cannot. A restored 1936 Cord 810 doesn't just look like the past. It sounds like the past when you start the engine. It smells like the past with its leather and oil and gasoline. It feels like the past when you grip the steering wheel and work the pre-selector gearbox. The car is history made real, history you can touch and drive and experience. And that is the story of America's legendary private car collections. The families who built them are passing from the scene, but the machines they preserved continue to inspire new generations of enthusiasts. Subscribe if you want more, and let me know in the comments. What's your favorite classic American car? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.